Hello and welcome to the interview at IU. I'm your host, Henry Holloway. Today I'm joined by a very special guest. Richard Roeper has reviewed films and television for over 25 years, spending nearly 4 decades with the Chicago Sun-Times, where he is still a contributor, as well as on the nationally syndicated Ebert and Roeper with the late, great Roger Ebert. He is also the host of the Movie of Your Life podcast, and his work can be found on ChicagoSunTimes.com, RogerEbert.com, ABC7 Television, and WGAM Radio. Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
Henry, it's my pleasure. I like our names, Henry Holloway and Richard Roeper. We both sound like we could be characters in like a Tolkien series. Two warriors going into the distance. Henry Holloway and Richard Roeper. I like the alliteration going there.
I like it a lot too. That sounds like a fun adventure. I gotta read more Tolkien and rewatch those movies. I've seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy like in bits and pieces, but I've never sat down to watch each movie all the way through, which I've got to do. I know you and Roger gave those movies great reviews as they deserved.
It's interesting though. They're very well made, Henry, but they're the kind of films I haven't gone back and watched them myself because there's just so many hours in the day, and between all the Star Wars movies and then The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and now we're going to get more Lord of the Rings and the Star Trek universe, and I love all those films, but at some point I'm like, I feel like we have the story. I think we know what's going on here.
Yeah, definitely. They do all follow a similar trajectory, but a lot of great films are influenced by prior films. Like the
Sure.
Star Wars was sort of evolution of the fantasy genre, going from Middle Earth to space, and somewhat inspired by the films of the 70s that were sort of spacey, but maybe didn't have the narrative depth of the Star Wars films, at least even in the original trilogy. But yeah, so I guess going off of that a little bit, I want to ask you first of all, just sort of tell our audience a little bit about your life and career trajectory. What inspired your love of movies and stories, and what led you to becoming a film critic in the first place?
Yeah, great question, Henry. It's interesting because everybody takes a different path, no matter what your career is. And for me, of course, I grew up in a lot different era than you did. I grew up in an era, Henry, where movies would play in theaters, and sometimes they'd play for 6 months or a year if they were big hits, or they'd play in what we called second run theaters. That would show, after a movie had played for 3 months. Like I grew up in the era of watching movies like the original Star Wars and Jaws and Rocky and Taxi Driver, all these great films of the 70s. So they played for 3 or 4, 5, 6 months in a theater for premium prices. And then what they called the dollar theater, which is what I would go to as a kid because you could put together $1 with your allowance or doing chores or whatever. And that's how I sort of fell in love with movies. That and watching them on late night television here in Chicago, WGN, which became a superstation, but Channel 9 would do the late night movie, and they would have all these old classic movies, the Humphrey Bogart movies, things like that, which to me as a kid growing up just south of Chicago seemed almost more exotic than Star Wars. These movies set, Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe and Here's Looking at You, Kid. That just seemed like such a magical world. So I was a huge movie fan. I went to Illinois State University and majored in journalism, but I was really more interested in becoming a writer because I knew I could be a writer. The idea of being on radio or TV seemed kind of like a crazy adventure. So I kind of came up the old fashioned way at the Chicago Sun-Times, started as a mailroom assistant, answering phones, eventually became a reporter, an entertainment critic and columnist. And that led to eventually doing movie reviews. And that all kind of led to everything I did in my career because I would write a column, then I'd be a guest on a radio show, which eventually led to me getting to host on weekends. I do weekly commentary on local television stations in Chicago. So it wasn't like I grew up saying I want to become a movie critic. In fact, I was a fan of and friends with both Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel. So unfortunately, Gene got sick and passed away, and there was auditions to be Roger's partner, and that's how I got the job on the show that became Ebert and Roeper. So it was kind of a winding path. I've written books about movies, but I've also written books about sports and other things. I One of the things I'll say, I know this is a long answer, Henry, but for people who do want to become film critics or film podcasters or make that a specialty, I think it's very important to do other things and study other things in life and not just get enmeshed in the world of film. Because there are some really good film critics out there that I feel sometimes talk only to other film critics, write for other film critics, write for cinephiles, and forget the general audience out there. You got to keep in mind that. And I think it helped me that I was a news reporter, that I covered sports, so that when I go to the world of the movies, I'm not just influenced by other movies, I'm influenced by real world experiences.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. I myself know I have to branch out a little more because when I get really interested in a movie or a few movies, I'm all in on the story and narrowed in on it. But I know I got to branch out more in terms of reading more and reading more books and watching more movies of different genres or even genres that I like. But it's funny you made that point because I remember one time Roger Ebert kind of said somewhat jokingly that, or maybe it was Gene Siskel, that Quentin Tarantino seems to you know uh, like be all immersed in movies, but maybe doesn't know much about anything else in life, or maybe it was maybe it was someone else who said that, but
Well, and I love Quentin Tarantino's films, but as I'm sure a lot of people who know more about movies than I do can pick apart every film he's done and saying every single part of this film is kind of inspired or derived from by other films. They're movies about movies for movie lovers, and that's great. But to whether Roger or Gene said that, Roger was a journalism major at the University of Illinois and was the editor of the Champaign-Urbana, newspaper down there. So kind of had a general interest. And Gene Siskel, I believe, majored in philosophy at Yale. So again, they didn't, especially that back then when they were coming up in the 60s, the film critic job, Henry, wasn't really considered a prestigious thing. It was kind of, oh, anybody can review movies. And then along came writers like Pauline Kael and people like Siskel and Ebert that elevated it. But to that point, and I think Tarantino's great, but there are some filmmakers who have done other things in life. There are screenwriters who have come from the world of journalism, who were in the military, who were scientists. Or you look at a writer like Andy Weir, who of course wrote The Martian and wrote Project Hail Mary, the books on which these great movies are based. And you probably know this story, Henry, but Andy Weir with The Martian, he couldn't get anybody to buy it as a book. He just started blogging it, mostly from the standpoint of a scientist, and it kind of took off from there. So I think it's very true that you want to have other interests in life. And for example, if you're a film critic and there's a movie, like a movie, for example, Oppenheimer, it helps greatly. You don't have to read a 700-page Oppenheimer biography, but it would help if you read some papers about him or did some research about the real man and the real time, and it will help inform your reviews and just your discussions. This is just advice I think for people who just love movies. And a lot of times people say, well, I didn't like this film because it, of this or that. And I point out, well, yeah, but they were trying to say this or that. Or, you have to look at it from the standpoint. Sinners is not to be taken literally. It's this major, this amazing multi-genre fable, and it's set in the real world, but still obviously has this supernatural element. So if you go into Sinners saying, well, that would never happen, well, neither would Field of Dreams.
right, yeah. Siskel, I remember he thought Field of Dreams was a little too it was a little bit too over the top, and but Roger found it very endearing. But I hate to admit it, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I still got to get around to that one, and I also got to get around to A League of Their Own, which is shot in Evansville, which is where my parents grew up, and so the
Oh,
fact
okay.
that I haven't seen that one is also a travesty. I've seen it in bits and
The
pieces, but
Evans The Evansville Purple Aces, I believe. I like knowing the nicknames for all the teams. I think the Evansville College team are the Purple Aces. You know what, though, Henry? Everybody has what I call black holes when it comes to movie going, especially, somebody younger like yourself. the great thing is, and Roger Ebert used to say this, he would always envy somebody who hadn't seen a great film that he'd seen 10 times, because you're going to get to see it for the first time and experience for the first time. There's no shame in saying, I haven't seen this, I haven't seen that. And in fact, for a number of years here in Chicago, I would host monthly screenings at a place called Soho House. It's kind of one of these clubs where people, and a lot of younger people, and when I say younger people, I'm talking maybe in their 20s and 30s. And I would pick a film, usually, on the anniversary of a film, Jaws or the first Halloween. And it would be a crowd of 50 or 60 people. And at the beginning of the film, I'd always say, all right, who has seen this movie? Who hasn't? And because it was a younger crowd, more than half usually hadn't seen the movie. And I would sit in the back row and watch them experience Jaws for the first time. And it was so much fun for me. And sometimes the films would work, like Jaws scared the hell out of people, and they loved it. And then I showed the first Halloween film to him, Henry. And if you go back and look at the first Halloween film, which I think is brilliantly done, but I think there's only something like, I want to say 5 on-screen murders in the whole film. And it takes about 45 minutes before we get to the first kill. And then, of course, the Scream movies turn that upside down on its head, and we got to kill in the first 5 minutes. But I could sense the audience thinking, like, when is something's going to happen in this movie? And of course, that's what I think made it so terrifying. If you look at a movie like Psycho, a lot of those films, in the 60s and 70s, there was a slow build that you couldn't do now because audiences don't have the patience for it. But it's fun for me to talk to people who have just seen a film for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that because Matt Damon said recently in an interview, I believe it was with Variety, that Netflix told him for this new movie him and Ben Affleck did to reiterate the plot like 5 times because people are on their phones. And I'm like, oh my God, you can't be on your phone. You got to focus in on the movie. That's why I like to watch movies here in my apartment with my roommate with the lights off. And he's like, "Why do you gotta have all the lights off?" And I'm like, "It's for the aesthetic to make it like a theater." And
Yes.
I try and always I'm always off my phone for a movie. We just watched Bugonia last night, and it's a
Okay.
pretty interesting film. But I don't know. My roommate, my cousin, he thought the ending was kind of dumb, and I kind of agree. But I thought it was kind of beautifully done. But at the end, all of a sudden, it seemed kind of silly. I don't know. But
I would agree with you guys. I thought, for people who haven't seen it, okay, we don't want to give too much away, but there are certain films I think if they left it more open to interpretation at the end instead of spelling it out, that it would have been better. Because I
yeah,
thought the same thing. I thought, well, what are we looking at here? This is ridiculous. And if you're watching it carefully, you tell about a half hour, maybe 40 minutes away from the end, you kind of know what the truth is in that film. There are a couple of pretty heavy hints dropped. But then to show it to us literally, it's interesting because there's like a movie like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Steven
love
Spielberg's
that
great
movie.
UFO epic. And there were different versions of that, because at first was like, do you want to see those aliens coming off the ship, or is it better to just see them in the background, or to see them, at all? And there are a lot of films like that where I think, and it's the same thing with TV shows. People talk about The Sopranos 20 years later because of that kind of open to interpretation ending. And first of all, I thought it was great because no matter what you did, if you had Tony Soprano and his family gunned down, people would have said, "Oh, geez, that he didn't deserve that, or we didn't deserve that, or not." So leaving it open, I go, well, we're talking about it 20 years later, so maybe it was effective. And I want to go back to your point about what Ben and Matt said about their film. And I like a lot of the superhero movies, especially I think in the 2000 teens, there were some really great superhero films. But in most of those films, there's about every half hour, everybody stands around and reiterates what the mission is and how they need to get the Tesseract or whatever. It's always the MacGuffin, as they call it, the magic thing, or in the Mission Impossible movies. Well, he's got the thumb drive. The only way we're going to be able to get past security is if we can infiltrate the billionaire's ball. I'll dress as a waiter. And they spell it out, whereas in a movie like Heat, we know what the heist is and we know what it's about, but they show the heist instead of saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to come in from this angle and we're going to flank this and that. And I feel like I don't think Netflix is wrong in saying that in terms of a viewer standpoint. From a creative standpoint, it stops the movie dead in its tracks. But the reality is, for this and I don't want to say this generation, because a lot of people my age are worse than people your age when it comes to being addicted to their phones and going on social media. Their attention spans are super short. So you have to be aware of that. And I think filmmakers, they have to take that into account. You have to, Ryan Gosling had a great comment. I don't know if you saw the other day when he showed up at a screening of Project Hail Mary, and he goes, making movies to get you guys in theaters isn't on you, to the theater goers. It's
I
on
saw
us.
that.
And good for him. He's right. If you make a Project Hail Mary, an Oppenheimer, a Barbie, people will go to the movies. If you're just going to make the 12th Fast and Furious movie, you can't be disappointed if people say, I'll just watch that on video in 30 days.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. And he's absolutely right that it is on the industry.
Yep.
And so before we get into that a little further, I do want to ask about, on your point about advising young critics. Siskel
Hmm.
and Ebert, in a segment advising young critics, they discussed their experiences becoming critics. And one of their key pieces of advice for young critics is to write concisely and to not lean too much into elegance and flowery writing. And what Siskel and Ebert and you and other critics on the show did so masterfully was convey depth and insight in your critiques and analysis of films while communicating them simply and sharply. So give us a little more insight into your evolution as a communicator and how you developed this skill. And what advice do you have for up and coming film critics along with that?
Yeah, and honestly, I learned from the masters with Siskel and particularly Roger Ebert. Roger was one of the smartest people I've ever known, and he could write about any subject. He was a historian. He was deeply into politics and science. He was a huge tech guy. I think he was the first person that really got me into Apple products when Apple first started coming out with their laptops and everything. But his writing style was very conversational, Henry, I would say. He could have written at a different level and used different phrases and quoted the German masters and done all that, but he was writing for the Chicago Sun-Times, which is a working class newspaper. Listen, a lot of very, very smart people read the Sun-Times, but it's, back in the day when it was more of a print paper, and it still is, but, it's tabloid size. So that means people were reading it on the train, on the bus, while having a break from their job as a postal worker or a construction worker. So you have to keep your audience in mind. You weren't writing a doctoral thesis about Taxi Driver. You were telling people, should they spend at their time, their $5. And I always kept that in mind. So when I write my reviews, I would write my reviews as if I were talking to you, Henry. Here's what I liked about the movie. Here's some of the cool insights I think I have. Some of the reasons I don't like it might be some of the reasons you're going to want to see it. And of course I'm going to use my knowledge and experience and say this thing is completely derivative of a film that most people might not have seen, or it's been done before, this and that. But when I see 200, 300 movies a year. So yes, of course I can see plot points and twists coming probably more readily. I don't need to brag about that in a review because the average person hasn't done that. So I'm not there to show off how much I know about a film or, and again, there's some critics I feel like all they want to do is just tear apart a movie. And I kind of feel like it'd be like being a music critic, but you don't like mainstream music. You don't like Taylor Swift. You don't like Bruce Springsteen. You don't like Bruno Mars, but you're going to be a pop music critic. Well, why are you doing that then? So my advice is to not to try to. It's kind of the cliched advice for everything about be true to yourself, but it's write what you know and love about, and don't try to sound like anyone other than yourself. In a very conversational tone. I write very quickly, and then I'll go back and look at things, and I'll say, okay, yeah, you could probably dress this up a little bit more or make this point a little more succinctly. This should go without saying, but you shouldn't even go to AI. The only thing I would go to AI for is for fact checking, but then you got to fact check the fact checkers, because I
Right.
get into battles sometimes with Chat GPT and I go, that's not true. Robert Duvall wasn't in that movie. And then they're like, oh, you caught me. But it is a research tool, just like Google is. And just like back in the day, the library, people, you fill out a library slip, you can double check things. But, it is, I don't say never use it because it's a very useful tool. For example, I just the other day was writing a review of an Apple TV series called Your Friends and Neighbors with John Hamm. Second season of the series. If people haven't seen it, John Hamm plays a hedge fund manager who becomes a high-end cat burglar in his ritzy neighborhood. And it occurred to me, Henry, that everybody always knows John Hamm from Mad Men, but he's played either a cop or a criminal so many times. He was FBI agent in The Town. He was an FBI agent in Richard Jewell. He was an FBI agent in Bad Times at the El Royale. He was a high-end thief, crook in Baby Driver. So I did say to ChatGPT, let me know about every John Hamm role where he played either a cop or a criminal or both. In Fargo season 5. So then I get the 9 things that he's done. Then I double check with IMDb, but it is very fast and efficient. But what bothers me is that I can tell in correspondence with people, and again, this is not generational. It's also I get emails from people. I know it was written with the help of AI, with Gemini. I can just tell the phrasing. It doesn't seem real. You reached out to me. It felt like an actual person was sending me an actual email asking me to be on a podcast. And, it breaks my heart when I see people say, I'm in college. I'm just going to use this to write my paper. You're missing the point of going to college. It's not just to get a job when you get out of college. It's to gain knowledge and to learn about the world and have the experience of going to college. So, my long-winded answer and advice for someone who wants to be a movie critic is, first of all, write the way you write. Writing is, no matter what, even if you're going to be a podcaster, go on TikTok or whatever, it still helps to write. You don't have to write your reviews out every time, but just doing it off the cuff, I see a lot of that too. And, it takes a long time for people to get to the point when they're just being conversational. So work on your writing skills. And again, the more you read, the better writer you're going to become.
Absolutely. That's perfectly said and absolutely right. And you're right. It just kills me when I go on Facebook and see all this stuff written with AI, and I can tell whenever I see it, and some of these posts that get like thousands of likes and loves, and people just have no idea. And it's like, dude, just like write yourself, like that just, that really gets to me. I hardly use ChatGPT and AI, and I never use it for writing, but that's perfectly well said. And so off of that a little bit, just looking back at the current state of cinema, Martin Scorsese has said Roger Ebert would be. I don't know if he used the word mortified, but he said Roger would be. I think something along the lines of mortified by the current state of cinema and its decline as a result of the hyper commercialization, the films that studios tend to greenlight being more so commercial, with monetization being a major factor, tending to select sequels and focus on franchises over standalone films. I remember you saying one time that it's lazy for critics to say that it's a bad year for movies. That would be like saying it's a bad year for books. And I have to kind of agree with you, considering that even in 2025, there are still a lot of auteur films that came out, were nominated for Best Picture, like, of course, Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another, which I just saw, Sinners, Hugonia, Hamnet, Train Dreams, Marty Supreme, and a couple of others. So what do you make of all this? Is the future of films bright, or is the mainstreaming of streaming and the looming dangers of artificial intelligence, as we just talked about, putting it all in peril? What's your outlook for the next 20 years or so? Like, where are we at 2050?
I think people will still be going to the movies because they like the, that communal feeling. I'm encouraged that I see a major chain like AMC has renovated almost every single theater across the country. So now, got the leather seats and the better sound systems. They invested in the viewing experience. It was a very depressing period, like right after the pandemic, Henry, where first of all, some theater chains and some smaller theaters just couldn't reopen, but also to see that theaters hadn't been kept up during that time, and they were kind of letting them fall into disarray. I'd be sitting in a theater going, God, the seat rest is worn. And I'm thinking of the average person who's, again, spending $13, $14. And then if, popcorn and parking and maybe getting a babysitter, it's $100 a night at the movies. And I'm thinking, you got to make it worth their while. And I always tell this when I give speeches to, to groups of people and business people or people who are parents or grandparents. I say, your kids and your grandkids, they want to go to the movies also because they want to get away from you. It's going to the movies is one of the first activities you can do when you're maybe 13 or 14, where you can go with your friends. Maybe if you're lucky enough to live in a neighborhood where you could walk or take your bikes, or your parents will drop you off at the movies and know you're at the movies, and then someone will come pick you up. You don't have to be supervised. So that's always a very exciting thing. Before you're old enough to drive, you can still go to the movies with your friends. And then again, even something like the Wicked movies, when I would I'd be going to a different screening, but there'd be Wicked would be playing down the hall, and you'd see all these young people dressing up as their favorite characters or doing the sing along, as long as it's established that it's going to be a sing along. But people were really excited about that. But having said that, as Larry David would say, having said that, it has changed, and it's never going to go back to the way it was. We're going to get movies that are going to go straight to streaming. We're going to see more and more writers and directors and actors working in streaming. And that's one of the things. Roger was such a movie purist, and he and I did disagree about this because by 2010, it was pretty obvious that we were in this prestige television era, actually a little before that, with Breaking Bad and Sopranos and shows like that. And that has continued on. And so for me, I've been reviewing television, if you will, streaming as much as film, because it's crazy, not to acknowledge when there's a Adolescence or Baby Reindeer or the Shogun series, these beautifully made hot button issue buzz series that everybody's talking about. Stranger Things, whether or not I loved all of them, I'm going to, I mentioned Your Friends and Neighbors, the John Hamm series. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that comes out on streaming. In fact, Netflix does a much better job with series than they do usually with original films. They'll do a $250 million heist film with Dwayne Johnson or Kevin Hart or whatever, and it's, not great. So I think everybody has to adjust to that. And, on the flip side, The Irishman doesn't get made without Netflix because Martin Scorsese's film, because his normal studio deal, they weren't going to put $200 million dollars up for what I thought was a good film, not a great film, but he's done that film a lot, and that wasn't going to get a big theatrical release. So at least these movies are getting made. So I think everybody's still trying to figure out on the business side of things how to make it work. The viewers have already decided they're going to go to movies if they really, really, really want to go see movies, and they're going to watch stuff at home. A lot of times, between the two, and even something like Marty Supreme. And I know this sounds like sacrilege for a film critic, but there are certain films, I think you should see F1 at the movies because it's a big popcorn movie. It's kind of a throwback to the 90s racing movies and action movies. I think you can see Marty Supreme at home, especially if you're watching it like you and your roommate do, where you're still respecting it and watching it in the dark. Or Train Dreams, which, by the way, is a Netflix film. It's a beautiful film. But, you could see that on your small screen and you're okay. And the other thing I would mention, Henry, you mentioned the Oscar nominees for Best Picture, the 10 nominees for Best Picture. Now, obviously, some of these are based on existing material. There was a different version of Frankenstein. Hamnet is based on, a story that's partially true from William Shakespeare's life. But the encouraging thing was none of those were franchise films or sequels. The 10 nominated pictures, which is pretty impressive, whether we're talking about Train Dreams, Begonia, obviously Sinners, One Battle After Another. And same thing with, some of the winning performances, Weapons, even something is kind of light and, no, I shouldn't say light, but, more mainstream like Song Sung Blue. It was an original film based on a documentary, based on a true story, but it was a good old fashioned movie. It wasn't Song Sung Blue 4, it wasn't, this 7 or, the sequel to that or the prequel to that. So I thought that was kind of encouraging.
Yeah, that's a great point and perfectly well said. A lot
Thank
of
you.
these films are not they're not franchise films, they're not sequel films, they're all standalones, and it's not like the ones nominated for Best Picture are the only films out there like that. So
Yeah.
kind of rounds back to your point that it's never a bad year for movies because hundreds, even thousands of movies are made every year. But off of that, I want to ask you about you brought up television and how television has evolved and how Roger Ebert was more of a film purist, so to speak. So I kind of, and you mentioned Breaking Bad, which is my favorite show of all time. I still got to get
Mhm.
around to The Sopranos and The Wire, but I love Breaking Bad, love Better Call Saul. As you may know, Jonathan Banks went here to Indiana University and he's come
Mm.
back from time to time. But with how television has evolved to have a more cinematic quality, particularly with shows like The Sopranos, as you mentioned, The Wire, of course, the phenomenal Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, I wonder what Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert would have made of this dynamic and what they would have made of these shows that have a cinematic quality but yet are also able to tell stories in such a way that films can't because they're so compressed. So, what do you make of this
Yeah.
evolution, and what do you think Siskel and Ebert would have made of it? What did they have to say about it?
Gene and Roger were very, very smart men, and they could read a room, and they would adjust their show sometimes to do different things, and they would do special shows about how black and white should never be colorized, and they would do, highlight documentaries, which at the time was pretty revolutionary to do a whole show about hoop dreams. So I'd like to believe that they would have on some level embraced the fact that some of the shows you mentioned, you look at a show like, and I know it's, there's a taint now because of Kevin Spacey, but House of Cards, when you look at that, David Fincher was directing episodes of House of Cards. David Fincher, Social Network, Seven, everything. So if directors like David Fincher are embracing television, if you will, streaming, and writers, Oscar-winning writers, and especially because still in our business, women have tougher times getting roles after the age of 50. Tom Cruise can still be an action hero at 60. But what we've seen is, everybody from Nicole Kidman to Reese Witherspoon to Helen Mirren. Michelle Pfeiffer's in 2 series right now. Well, she's in the Madison, a Taylor Sheridan series, and then she's in a upcoming series called Margot's Got Money Troubles with Elle Fanning. I've seen both of them, and Michelle Pfeiffer hasn't done that much work, whether it's by choice or because the movie roles aren't out there for a 66-year-old actress. So wow. I think that the guys would have embraced that, on some level. And you look at something like Game of Thrones, Henry. They were spending something like $8 to $10 million per episode on Game of Thrones. Those were 70-minute movies that just happened to follow the progress of a series. But each one of those played like a film, looked like a film, had extras and not just CGI, had costumes, and they would go to Iceland and they'd go to Croatia or wherever the case may be, and they were when you see the credits, it's like the credits for a film. Hundreds of people working on these. So a lot of these series are being made as pieces of cinema to me, or with the same kind of care. And certainly if you look at the credits, the people scoring these shows have won Oscars and Emmys, the cinematographers, the editors, the costume designers. So if the top of the line creative artists don't have a problem jumping back and forth between film and television, I don't think the viewers or the critics should.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned House of Cards. I saw House of Cards before I saw Breaking Bad, and I thought it was not nearly as good overall. The first couple of seasons were all right, but then it kind of really fell off.
Yeah,
but
it
Game of
definitely did.
Game of Thrones I haven't seen yet, but the last season I heard all about that, and
yeah, people got really upset about that, which is great, and I get, because they all of a sudden they had to take this epic, and in 6 episodes or whatever it was, they want. It's funny because we talked about The Sopranos with an open-ended, ending, and then Game of Thrones tried to tie everything together, and then people got really mad about that. But what I like is that people get that worked up about it. When people are yelling at me on Twitter about a review, I don't take it, I don't take it personally, even if they get into personal insults. But I'm like, if you got that worked up, I always tell people, if you got that worked up over a television show or a series or a film, you had a pretty good week. If that's the worst thing that happened to you was that your favorite show disappointed you. But I don't, I don't mock that. People invest their time and their, interest and into series and movies. So nobody has an opinion that's not valid. So if you get that worked up about a series, I'm like, well, that's still pretty cool. And I always say to people, if you watch 60 episodes of a show and you didn't like the way it ended, it shouldn't soil and dampen and mitigate how much fun you had watching the series all the way up to that.
Yeah, like Stranger Things, kind of.
Yeah.
Thought the final season had potent moments, but the finale, the final battle was a little like, the fact that they're in the final battle and Nancy gives Mike, a flare gun, and, Lucas is like, that's a flare gun, and puts his hand on his shoulder. Like, they're in that little danger when they're on this desert planet in the final battle. That to me was just like atrocious. But then the climax when Winona Ryder, chops Vecna's head off. That was a pretty potent moment. And after that, the climax, with Elle and all that, that was really touching and beautiful. So I have to give credit where credit is due. I think people like leaning into the negativity, and they're not nuanced enough with their overall assessment.
Well, people get mad if they didn't get the ending they wanted. And if you get 20 different people, they want 20 different endings. So Breaking Bad, spoiler alert, Walter White is killed at the end of Breaking Bad, right? It's
Yeah.
very evident and obvious, and it's very evident and obvious that Jesse gets away. We see that in El Camino, the movie that was made. But to this day, there are people who I think Walter White really survived.
Yeah.
He was shot 9 times in the chest. He had terminal cancer, but his eyes, I think I saw his eyes, his pupils were moving, because they don't want him to be dead because they love the character so much or love hating the character, whatever the case may be. So that's what I see a lot of with people where they're like, I hated the ending of this, and I wanted the ending to be that. I said, but that's not, that's fine. But it's people that they wanted a certain ending. And no matter what the ending is, with millions of people watching something, you could have the best ending of all time, something like The Usual Suspects or The Sixth Sense with these great twist endings, and people are like, oh, I hated that ending. I didn't want to be fooled. So you can't win. And for the filmmakers, for the writers, if they're trying to please everyone, that's when you see a film sometimes hedge its bets too, where they give us sometimes 4 endings to a film, and you're like, 1 year later, we didn't need to see 1 year later. You talk about endings of movies and how they, if you look at a film like Shawshank Redemption, have you seen that one, Henry?
Oh
Shawshank.
yeah. I've got the
Yeah.
book
So
right now at different seasons, and I still got to get into reading that.
so Shawshank, one of the most beloved films of all time, and at the very end, Andy Dufresne. Again, I'm going to give spoiler alerts from movies from 35 years ago, 40 years ago.
Sure,
Sorry,
yeah.
folks, but so Morgan Freeman's Red has been parole. He was finally given parole, right? And he had made this pact: if Andy ever got out, they would find each other. So the very last scene, he's on the bus. Tim Robbins' character of Andy Dufresne, and he finally gets to this tropical paradise where Red's working on a boat, and you see this long, long shot of the two friends coming to see each other. We didn't need to see them. We didn't. They ended it there. They pulled back, and we see them, and we're like, okay, we hope that they have 15 years on that island just working as friends and working the fishing boat, whatever the case may be. We didn't need to see them hugging. How you been? I can't believe you made it here. Let's go to the bar and talk about it. And some movies would do that. And same thing with Jaws. Jaws actually has a very similar ending in that the survivors of the crazy shark thing, the 2 guys who survived, you see them paddling toward the shore. You don't need to see them get to Amity Island. Let me find that mayor and tell him he was wrong and getting embraced by their loved ones. We know all that's going to happen. So sometimes less is more with these endings.
That's beautifully said. And it's funny, I've seen Jaws like 11 times. I saw it in IMAX with my brother this past August for the 50th anniversary up at the Indiana State Museum. And that's perfectly well said, because they, you see them coming back, and what a beautiful ending that is with the music, and they're swimming back with the barrels, and that theme that is often overlooked because of, everyone thinks when they think of the theme of Jaws, they think of the da 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 da,
Yeah.
but they don't think of that theme, da na 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 na
Yeah.
na. What a beautiful theme that is. And when they get onto the back to the island, as a kid, I thought, maybe they could have shown like, him get back with his wife, because the last time we see Lorraine Gary is when she's running away and when she's kind of like turned off by Quinn, in an amazing performance by Robert Shaw. But that you're right, it's sort of perfectly done where you just see them get back to the island. You don't need to see anything more beyond that. And it's very similar to The Shawshank Redemption. I never really thought about that, but The Shawshank Redemption is perfect because it's such a beautiful ending. But you see him getting to the island. It's more beautiful because you see him or the beach or whatever. You see him getting there, but you don't see them like hugging. So it's the perfect balance that they find.
You can let it live on in your mind what would happen. The other thing I find interesting, I'd like to mention about Jaws, Henry, is, there's all these different memes and gifs or whatever, but people always like to say, you're going to need a bigger boat, right? That's one of the famous lines from Roy Scheider. We're going to need a bigger boat. And people use that for everything. But what I find interesting is when you watch the movie, he wasn't saying that like a wise ass comment or a deadpan crack. He was actually saying we need to leave here right now in this boat and go get a bigger boat. It wasn't a euphemism. It wasn't we're overmatched. Because he actually says, come on, we're going to go get a bigger boat. So when he says we're going to need a bigger boat, it's become this sort of, euphemism for everything now. People, oh, we're going to need a bigger boat. You know, the guy signs a multi-zillion-dollar contract. Oh, he's going to need a bigger boat. But in the actual movie, he's saying, we got to go back to shore and get a bigger boat, which is funnier, actually.
That's actually a great point. I never thought of that. It's funny. I actually read the book by Peter Benchley right after I saw the movie for the first time in the third grade, and it's
Oh, geez.
interesting how the book is somewhat different from the movie, and how they actually didn't use Peter Benchley's screenplay for the movie, but the movie I think is cut down to the nuts and bolts just right. Quentin Tarantino says it's the perfect movie, and he's absolutely right about that.
You know, there are a lot of in a lot of cases the people say, "Oh, the book was better than the movie." And I'm always saying, "Well, the book is different from the movie." But there are cases of some classic films from the '70s, including Jaws. The movie is infinitely superior. The book is a beach read, really. You know, it's a big fat paperback novel. Same thing with The Godfather. The Godfather is a fun read, but is in nowhere. And Mario Puzo, of course, did work on the screenplay, but the films are infinitely higher elevated pieces of art than the book material, the source material.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I started reading The Godfather last year after seeing the movie, but that's when I also got to get back into. It's funny, I've seen The Godfather twice, but the first time I watched it with my roommate, we watched it over the course of a few different nights. Same thing with Godfather Part 2 and Part 3, but then I watched it again with my friends in my one of my friends' basements, but we were drinking wine and eating cheese and crackers, so it led to maybe my friends being a little bit more talkative than we should have been during the movie.
That's all right. That's
Not to
okay.
scold
That's
them,
all right.
but yeah. So off of that, I was wondering if I could read you a short review that I wrote for Marty Supreme, and then get some of your insights on the other side.
Okay.
All right. Marty Supreme might not be your typical sports movie. In fact, it might not be your typical any kind of movie. While at times comedic, it certainly lacks the fluffiness and warmth of a sports film like Breaking Away, nor is it composed of the team player mindset embodied in films such as The Way Back, Hoosiers, Glory Road, or Remember the Titans. If one thing's for sure, Marty Mauser, Timothy Chalamet, is not a team player. That much is clear. A hyper-individualist, relentless hustler, Mauser, a shoe salesman in early 1950s New York, does everything in his power to pursue his dream of being one of the best, if not the best, table tennis players in the world. While doing so, we see him undergo a somewhat strained relationship with his mother, Fran Drescher, fail to fulfill his duties as a father-to-be upon impregnating his married girlfriend, Rachel Meisler, Odessa Zion, and have an affair with 1930s Hollywood starlet Kay Stone, Gwyneth Paltrow, an actress who was popular in films 2 decades prior. Sound familiar? Another role that perhaps hits too close to home is Stone's husband, wealthy financier and pen salesman Milton Rockwell, Kevin O'Leary. The film is both compelling and surprising, ranging from the politically incorrect banter between Mauser, who is Jewish, and his African American friend Wally, Tyler the Creator, to a subplot involving a lost dog that Marty and Rachel are expected to return, resulting in a few casualties of a few mob-like businessmen in a shocking turn of events. Amidst all of these threads and Mauser's relentless jerkiness towards anyone and everyone he comes into contact with, he is eventually humbled while still coming up on top as the champion in a Japanese tournament he was supposed to throw for Rockwell so the latter could sell his pens in the country, particularly crucial for the businessman in the immediate aftermath of World War II. While not being able to play in the championship tournament, he cut corners to obtain the amount of money necessary to get in, and did a few other embarrassing things, I might add. The film still gives him the climactic victory necessary to regain his confidence, while circumstances back home and his forced reckoning with reality still manage to teach him one of the most important lessons of all. What is your
Very
take
good.
on that, Richard?
Very, very good. I really liked how you started the review because I think a lot of reviewers want to immediately start describing the plot. And you're telling us a little bit about what genre the movie is, but how it's not a part of that genre and is not typical. So that's very, very strong. I would say, like, when you say at the beginning, you say something like, for one thing or something, for one thing, Marty's not a team player. That much is clear. You don't need to say for one thing or that much is clear because you're going to make it clear to us. You can just say Marty is not a team player. Or you can say, unlike, the guys in Breaking Bad. But you did a really good job of setting up the film. So, and then you described the characters very well. One thing I would do, Henry, is and I have a tendency to do this myself, you start introducing different characters, and in each time you put the name of the actor, I'm assuming in parentheses, right? An actress,
Yeah.
Gwyneth Paltrow. To mix it up, you can say, Gwyneth Paltrow plays blah, 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 so that you don't just have and then that gives you room to uh, criticize or laud their performances. So you can say, in a role that might hit too close to home, Gwyneth Paltrow is Gwyneth Paltrow is very effective, playing blah blah blah. Kevin O'Leary, who you might know from this, turns out to be a surprisingly good actor as blah blah blah. And that way, you're not just saying character, name of the actor in parentheses. It gives you actually the freedom to add in some of your own voice, but it also breaks it up so it's not just. And I find myself doing this to this day in reviews where I'm like, okay, I just listed six, like I mentioned, your friends and neighbors, and it's like, Olivia Munn's in there and James Marsden, but I'll switch it up and say, we're seeing a lot of James Marsden lately, and isn't that a fantastic thing? Marsden continues his streak of hot roles, leaning into the character of Owen Ash, brash and charismatic billionaire who may or may not be blah blah blah. So I would just say that's in the middle of it. You could kind of make it so it doesn't kind of lull the reader into you're just reading a list of actors and performances, but very strong. And then when you get into it at the end, I like that as well. So very well done. The lead in particular, I like the way you told us about the movie without telling us everything in the movie. You're like, okay, here's what this is. You might think it's this and it's not that. And the other thing, and I don't know if you do this in the entirety of the review, anytime if something you found really effective, whether it's like this is a period piece, so I always love to say, like, something as simple as the production design and costumes instantly plunge us into New York in 19 whatever, just kind of painting that picture for the reader.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course.
It's a real honor and privilege to get your advice one on one. That's
My pleasure.
incredible. I really like that, and
Thank you.
I also like your honest feedback as well. I was starting to think it might be a little insulting to say Gwyneth Paltrow, like in real life, she was popular in roles 2 decades prior. I mean, she's always remained popular, and she's always
Well, you
been.
could, and exactly. I mean, that does you don't want to sound. Listen, you can be critical, but you don't want to sound like kind of snarky. So yeah, I mean, and
Right.
she is very good. And you can say, Gwyneth Paltrow plays an actress who peaked 2 decades ago, but Paltrow continues to deliver, stellar work. Blah 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 blah. So she's actually it's not playing herself. She's playing, an actress with very bare bones similarities, but the difference of the parallels is that Gwyneth Paltrow continues to do great work. Which I think is it's a valid thing. Listen, a lot of time there's a movie called Fantasy Life. It's a small independent film where Amanda Peet plays an actress in her 50s who kind of had a little splash of success and then didn't have as much. So clearly there's a little bit of that. But Amanda Peet continues to do great work. But, she knows when she's playing, an actress of a certain age who isn't getting the big movies maybe she got 25 years ago, that some people are going to go, oh, she's just playing herself.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And off of that point, though, about Gwyneth Paltrow, I wanted to ask about. Let's see, where did I have this right here? Oh yeah. So, kind of looking at the current state of comedy, just to switch things up a bit, I've noticed that at least in the stand-up comedy realm, which I've gotten into in the past few years, it's been interesting watching how conversations about political correctness have shifted less from being artistically savvy, like comedians like George Carlin or the contemporary Anthony Jeselnik, to being more about hackery in the name of offending. And I think that in the context of cinema and addressing contentious social issues, that there's truth to the idea that bravery in exploring contentious issues with both heart and humor is something we see less of, because those who may be inclined to do so maybe would be less likely to venture into that territory. But one example of a film that I saw recently, per your recommendation, is Shallow Hal with Jack Black and Gwyneth Paltrow,
Hmm.
which has a very poignant point to make while doing so with politically incorrect humor about the importance of seeing someone's inner beauty and coming out to appreciate that. And what I thought the film did so masterfully is that it got the audience used to the idea of Rosemary, the Gwyneth Paltrow character, as what Gwyneth Paltrow actually looks like, with some shots of the character's actual body without her face, and then eventually we see her full self, and it's still the same personality, the same face, the same voice, and it actually quite provocatively questions Western society's conception of beauty without being preachy by doing so by shrouding the message in humor, finding a perfect balance. And you, when you put it on your top 10 list for 2001, you made a great point when you said that critics will often praise comedies but never dare to put it on their top 10 list. So give me your read on that as well as the current state of comedy as you see it, particularly in film.
Yeah, and that's still to this day, as you know. I mean, comedic performances almost never get nominated. Comedic films back in the day, something like It Happened One Night or even Annie Hall, films like that would get praised as much as dramas, and they just don't anymore. And as far as you know, comedy, I wish we would see more edgy comedy, and yeah, sometimes it might offend or it might provoke, but if you look at Tropic Thunder, and some people say, "Oh, that would never get made," well, that's too bad because if you watch the film, you realize that the statements it's making, and same thing with Shallow Hal. And I'll say this too: the Farrelly brothers were among the first filmmakers to consistently put actors who have challenges and disabilities in roles I'm not talking about Gwyneth Paltrow because that's not a disability. She was just somebody who was had a weight problem, but you see a lot of actors who actually do have disabilities. And now there's a big debate: can you play someone with a disability if you don't have that? Can you play someone of an ethnicity if you don't have that? And I think it's healthy, and I think it's an improvement from the old days, but I also think it can get overdone. And I think with comedy right now, stand-up comedy is edgy, and sometimes it's really funny, and sometimes you feel like these comics are just trying to make a name by being edgy. But comedy in film, I mean, unfortunately, it's safer probably now than ever before. So you get a lot of alleged comedies, but it's really just Mark Wahlberg playing the dad who's secretly an FBI agent, and then he gets dragged back into it, or Kevin Hart. There's a lot of it seems to be an epidemic of guys who used to be off the grid, undercover operatives, special ops, or FBI agents, and now they're living as suburban dads, and then it comes back to haunt them, and then they have to go. And listen, in a film like
Yeah.
Nobody with Bob Odenkirk, it was done great because it was raw and edgy and violent and brutal, and we didn't expect that. But a lot of times, I feel like I'm seeing the same movie over and over again. So, the comedy, the romantic comedy, the romantic comedies, even if you look at something like Pretty Woman or Notting Hill, all those great films from the 90s or, the early 2000s, a lot of times they were rated R. Sometimes some pretty dark stuff would happen in them. But yeah, of course, then you'd usually get a fairy tale ending. And we don't really get even those anymore. Even in the 2000s, we got some, even if it was something like The 40-Year-Old Virgin or Knocked Up, which could be, raw and raunchy. But they were, at heart, there was still usually a romance in there. And you don't see that much anymore. And I don't know why. And I think that's one of the reasons why people, I think, are overly excited about The Devil Wears Prada, too, just because we just don't have many movies. I'm like, geez, did I miss something? I thought the first movie was okay. And people are acting like it's, the sequel of the. I've never seen, and they're doing a great job with the publicity because, man, every time, oh, man, we just happened to catch a a photo of them filming. I don't know how you got so close, but I do think that they do love those kinds of movies, and we don't get too many, whether it's a romantic comedy or just a kind of edgy comedy. We just don't even like, you look at something like Game Night, or something like that, which wasn't
I
very
love
long
Game
ago, but
Night.
but it's got a darkness to it. We don't get too many of those anymore.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Amanda Peet. She was, of course, great in Identity Thief with Melissa McCarthy and Jason Bateman, which was I think, a good throwback to films like Planes,
Yeah.
Trains, and Automobiles, which I love. Not as good as Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, but still a very well done comedy film. And you mentioned Mark Wahlberg, who was great in Ted, which I love, and Ted 2. And
Yes.
Mark Wahlberg, he maybe used to be a little bit too edgy in his own life, but it's kind of
Yeah,
good
I
he's
think
kind
he,
of
and you know
come
what?
back from
Yeah, and
that.
I think he's trying to make up for that. And everybody has their own path. But when I look at Dwayne Johnson, who admirably took a swing last year and was in a gritty film, it's not easy to do that because they get surrounded by people saying, "Listen, this is going to make money." So if you're Kevin Hart, if you're Mark Wahlberg, if you're Dwayne Johnson, you just keep making the same movie over and over again because it's going to make money. You're going to get a giant paycheck. And I know for a fact, like somebody like Kevin Hart has, I think, maybe 100 people working for him in his production offices. So he's thinking, I got to make money because people's livelihoods are depending on me. But that's not when you make your best films. It's when you take your
Yeah.
chances. So you look at other actors who could take the easy route. And I mentioned John Hamm. John Hamm's a guy after Mad Men could have, and he's done some leading man roles, but he's leaned into character roles. So it's like, okay, the town, I'll play the FBI agent. I'll take a supporting role and I'll do character work. And even somebody like Sean Penn, who's a giant movie star, but doesn't would rather be in Ukraine than at the Oscars because he really, and it's not performative. He's been that guy for 30 years. Or
Yeah.
Brad Pitt, or Clooney. They continue to take interesting roles. Yeah, they'll do the big movies and Ocean sequel or whatever. But then they're like, no, I'm going to play Brad Pitt, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Well, he's a supporting player, and it ends up being one of the best roles of his career. So it's up to each actor to what are they going to do? You're going to take the easy route and do the same movie over and over again, or take some chances. And I think when it comes to comedy, the studios are very, they're not going to spend $75 million in most cases on an edgy comedy. They'd rather spend $150 million on another wacky heist movie.
That's too bad because it
It is.
yields less diversity of creativity. But it's funny you
Yep.
mentioned Sean Penn. You're right; he has always been that guy. And it was funny. My roommate and I, we just saw Team America: World Police, and I saw the pop culture brain guy did a video he did on it, and how Sean Penn wrote Trey Parker and Matt Stone an angry letter and signed it off, fuck you, and said and dared them to go to Iraq with him, which they didn't do, I think. But that was a pretty good satire of Hollywood, and had a lot to say. And I just saw your review of it with Roger and how you liked it a bit more than him. I do think there could have been more jokes, though. I think them cutting out jokes was a mistake. But
Agreed.
uh, is it true though that Dwayne Johnson, my cousin was telling me that he in his contract he won't do roles that he won't do roles where his character dies at the end or where he loses. Is that true?
I don't know if that's true. I know that was, in the old days, John Wayne, he finally was killed in, I think, in a movie called The Cowboys. And for 30 years,
Great
he wouldn't,
movie.
yeah, yeah. And it usually ends up being the better movie. I don't know if it's in his contract. I think there are certain actors who are like, I don't want to get killed at the end. And also, I don't want to they'll play a villain, but there's certain roles they won't take. And again, I think, well, then you're limiting yourself. And if you look at somebody like Anthony Hopkins, who's one of the great actors of all time, and one of the reasons is because if it's a great role, okay, he'll play Hannibal Lecter, and then he'll play in a period piece, or he'll play a kindly grandfather. It's about the role, not about, oh, I don't want some audience to think I'm really that bad guy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I know a lot of actors want to maintain a brand, but it was kind of like what Roger Ebert was talking about in the introduction to his interview with River Phoenix, is that River Phoenix could have been like the sort of, the hot young movie star that all the girls liked after he did Stand By Me, but he continued to lean into the edgy dramas, and
Mm-hmm.
with films like Running on Empty, which wouldn't necessarily, hurt his brand, but then he did, more subversive films like My Own Private Idaho, which is a film that I really admire and respect and wrote a lot about in this essay I wrote that's on my Substack on the career of River Phoenix and his life as well. But off of that a little bit, uh, just on the on that point, I saw Michael Shannon last night at the IU Cinema. I'm for my contemporary filmmakers class, which is taught by the director of the IU Cinema, Alicia Cosma, and we watched the film Take Shelter. And Michael Shannon spoke afterwards and did a Q&A. There's another film playing tonight, and he's going to do a Q&A after. and he's also a musician. He played at the Bluebird here in Bloomington like
Hmm.
10 days ago, 11 days ago, and he was talking about in this Q&A how he's flying out of Indianapolis on Saturday to do a film in New York, where he's going to act alongside a 16-year-old actor, which is who never doesn't hasn't done much acting. But when you look at his brand and his kind of the roles that he takes on, like in Take Shelter, where that you think is going to be a movie about storms, you think it might be just another day after tomorrow, but it actually delves really deeply into mental illness and psychology, and I mean, what a range to that performance, and you can tell he just doesn't really give a care, you know, to put it cleanly, about maintaining some sort of like leading man brand that it would be typical of what you might see in other actors, and it's really admirable and really interesting. What are your thoughts on that? And if I get a chance to speak to Michael Shannon afterwards or ask a question, are there any questions you would recommend throwing his way?
Oh, I'm going to leave that up to you, but I'll say this: that Michael Shannon, there's the famous photo of him. He was nominated for an Oscar, and he's in a bar in Chicago watching the Oscars, and people were like, "Oh, wow, what an outlaw thing!" And it was actually because there was a play he was involved in, I think, as a producer in Chicago, and it was closing night, and he didn't want to abandon the theater troupe that night. That's why he was at a local bar, not at the Oscars. And Michael Shannon has that. There's that Chicago mentality. There's a lot of actors, that are active in theater in Chicago that have gone on to become big stars. Steppenwolf is one of the most famous theaters here, but there's a bunch of them. So John Malkovich and Laurie Metcalf and Michael Shannon and Jeremy Piven, the Cusacks. There's Amy Madigan, who just won an Academy Award, and there's this kind of Tracy Letts, who is a great playwright and great character actor. They remain true to that Chicago. They'll come back and do theater, and then they'll go do a giant movie, and then they'll go back and do a small film. And there's that kind of devotion to. They give just as much in a performance in front of 75 people at a storefront theater in Chicago, or a bigger theater like the Goodman in Chicago, and they keep coming back, over and over again, whether they live here or not. The Chicago roots and the love of the work. So even David Schwimmer, who founded a group called Looking Glass in Chicago. So he's doing Friends and making all the money in the world, but he was spending just as much time with his theater troupe, putting on plays in a theater that seated maybe 150 people. So there's that. I really admire that, acting first, stardom second approach.
Yeah, no, that's well said, and that I think perfectly conveys the kind of demeanor and disposition that Mr. Shannon had last night at the IU Cinema. It seems very humble and down to earth, and just sort of kind of going with the flow. And I'll have to, if I get a chance, I'll have to mention that to him tonight. And what you said, but just before we run out of time, I assume you probably got to go fairly shortly.
I do.
Um,
I'm running late, but I'll take one more question. They can wait.
sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate
Sure.
your time, sir. And so, just to wrap things up, just to combine two short questions into one, tell us a little bit about the personal sides of Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, and what is your least favorite movie of all time, and what is your favorite movie of all time?
Okay, I'll start with Gene and Roger because I was friends with both of them. Gene and I shared a love of sports. Roger was a casual sports fan, but Gene Siskel was like the Spike Lee of the Chicago Bulls, as Spike is with the Knicks. Love the Chicago Bulls. So we would talk about sports a lot. We would maybe even occasionally bet on a horse race together. And Gene, Gene was a more, I don't want to say calculating, but a more pragmatic, straight thinking. Let's do this, let's do that. And Roger was more head in the clouds and a little more, let's try this and then we can try that. Roger and I got to be really good friends with Roger because in addition to doing the show, we would travel together and we'd go on the Tonight Show or we'd go on Conan's show. So you get to know somebody. Just a warm and lovely and incredibly smart person, just an engaging conversationalist. So when I come away blessed they recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Siskel and Ebert here in Chicago, and they had
Wow.
all kinds of proclamations. And Roger's widow Chaz, who I'm really good friends with, was there, and then Gene's widow Marlene, who I don't see as often because she doesn't live here. And it was so great to be with them and to be friends with both of them as well. So I treasure all of that. When it comes to least favorite movie, I don't think I have one, Henry, because when they're bad, they're kind of forgettable, and they all
The
are kind of
Heartbreak
in the
Kid?
bottom of the. They're all at the bottom of the muck. So for worst film of all time, I don't know if I have a least favorite. The films that I usually would give 0 stars to are sometimes where I feel like they're exploiting, especially when they're putting children in danger, just for the grisly, dark entertainment, if you will, and not
Like
there could be
Cinema
children in
Rink,
danger.
yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean. But my favorites are kind of the usual list. I do have the first two Godfather films. I do love the Tarantino films. I love Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
Oh
Shawshank.
yeah.
But I also, as I mentioned at the top of this conversation, and we talked about the classics, and the Maltese Falcon with Humphrey Bogart is one of my favorite movies because it's one of the movies I remember seeing as a kid, and again seeing that world seems so exotic and foreign to me. It was like watching an outer space movie. So it's films like that, film noir, and then again, I do love. We mentioned some romantic comedies, and they don't get enough play. And I'll put Notting Hill on once a year, Love Actually during the holidays, and people say, well, it's problematic, it's this and that. I'm like, yeah, but it's so
Mhm.
well done and beautifully written and great acting. So I like anything else. It's like saying, what's your favorite song? Sometimes it depends on your mood.
That's a great answer, and I couldn't agree more. I'll have to check out Notting Hill. Got to check out Maltese Falcon. But
Please do.
you know, thank you so much. And real quick, I'll just mention, as you said about seeing films for the first time, you're jealous of people who haven't seen them. My brother has not seen Stand By Me, but he loves The Sandlot, which is very much inspired by Stand By Me.
Yeah,
And we're going to go see
yeah.
Stand By Me on June 13th at the Murat in Indianapolis, and Will Wheaton, Corey Feldman, and Jerry O'Connell are going to do a Q&A afterwards. So what an incredible way to see it for the first time. And
Yeah.
just a real quick note, my grandfather knew Sid Pollock for a long time. They were good
Oh,
friends. They
wow.
studied together at the neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner. And my
That's cool.
parents and grandfather actually, my grandmother didn't want to go, but they went up on Sid's plane all the way out over Dayton, Ohio from Indianapolis when he came to the Heartland Film Festival in 1993, the same year that his son tragically was killed in a plane
Hmm.
accident. But they went out to lunch
Yeah,
with him,
yeah.
and he's called our house. He got me a bunny when I was a baby. So really
I love it.
incredible experience. And well, thank you so much for your time, and it was great to have you.
My pleasure. Be well, Henry. Good luck to you.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks so much. All
All
right.
right.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank
All
you.
right. That was the interview at IU. See you next time.